Namaste. In this lecture, we shall explore pollution, air, water, soil, noise, and light pollution. Our central theme is pollution as an ecological stress, meaning we will treat pollution not simply as an environmental hazard to human health, but as a mechanism that alters the conditions under which living systems function. This framing will help us understand how pollution fits into the broader story of biodiversity loss. In this lecture, we will first understand what pollution means in ecological terms. We will then distinguish between acute and chronic pollution. After that, we will examine the major forms of pollution. We will also look at ecological effects on organisms and ecosystems. And finally, we will connect the topic to sustainability, monitoring, and response. The image of a waste dump with leachate flowing out into the water bodies, part of the waste burning, releasing smoke, and trash spreading into the surroundings reminds us that pollution often affects ecosystems through multiple pathways at the same time. Pollution is the harmful introduction of substances or energy into the environment. This definition is broader than what many people expect. It includes chemical substances such as industrial discharge, pesticides, and heavy metals. But it also includes harmful forms of energy such as excessive noise or artificial light at night. The key idea in any definition of pollution is harm to living systems. Pollution alters the ecological conditions under which organisms live. When those conditions shift beyond the tolerance of a species or a community, ecological damage follows. So, pollution is fundamentally a question of changed conditions, not just contaminated matter. An important distinction running through this course is the difference between acute and chronic pollution. Acute pollution is sudden and severe. A major industrial spill, a chemical release, or an oil discharge into a river are typical examples. Chronic pollution, by contrast, is lower level but continuous. In this slide, we see workers applying pesticides to a crop, which is a useful example of how repeated chemical use can contribute to ongoing pollution through runoff and accumulation. Persistent traffic noise or gradually accumulating heavy metals in sediments are also examples of chronic pollution. Both types can damage biodiversity, but they operate on different time scales and through different mechanisms. So the distinction matters for monitoring, management, and response. We should pay special attention to chronic pollution because it is the form most likely to be underestimated. Damage accumulates gradually. Organisms may show stress, reduced reproduction, or altered behavior long before a system looks visibly degraded. A community may shift in composition, with sensitive species declining quietly over the years, while casual observation suggests that everything is fine because all species are there. The image helps us see this clearly, with industry in the background, an agricultural field in the foreground, and haze in the air, showing how pollution can be present even when damage does not appear dramatic at first. This is exactly why ecological monitoring becomes essential. Without repeated measurement and trend analysis, chronic pollution can cause lasting biodiversity loss before anyone even recognizes the pattern. We now turn to the 5 forms of pollution covered in this lecture. The industrial smokestacks billowing smoke in the image provide a clear starting point, showing air pollution as a major form that can damage living beings and alter ecosystem chemistry. Water pollution moves through aquatic habitats and food webs. Soil contamination harms below ground life and nutrient cycles. Noise pollution disrupts behavior and communication. Light pollution alters the natural day-night rhythm that many species depend upon, disrupting mating signals in fireflies and directional signals that are used by migratory birds. And together, these five forms show how pollution enters and damages ecological systems across different environmental media. Air pollution is often discussed mainly in relation to human health, but ecosystems are also heavily affected. The vehicular exhaust shown on the slide is a familiar example of how airborne pollutants enter the environment, where they can affect plant tissues, damage cell structure, and reduce growth rates. They can also deposit into soils and water bodies, altering the chemical conditions of those systems. Air pollution is therefore a stressor that can change conditions across terrestrial and aquatic systems simultaneously. Water pollution is one of the most serious biodiversity threats, partly because pollutants spread easily through water and affect many organisms at once. The image of polluted water flowing through a drainage pipe is a clear visual example of water pollution, helping illustrate sources such as sewage, industrial discharge, and contaminated urban runoff entering aquatic systems directly. Freshwater ecosystems are especially vulnerable because they receive inputs from large surrounding areas, and many aquatic species have narrow tolerances for chemical and oxygen conditions. Water carries pollutants through entire habitats rather than keeping them contained. Fish, amphibians, aquatic plants, invertebrates, and microbes are all exposed directly and often continuously. The image of trash in a river helps show how pollutants spread through the aquatic habitats and remain in direct contact with many organisms. Pollution also reduces dissolved oxygen levels, changes pH, increases turbidity, and introduces toxic substances. These changes affect not just individual organisms but whole communities. Food webs can collapse when key species decline, and ecological balance can shift into a degraded state that is very difficult to reverse. Soil is not inert ground. It is a biologically active system. Nutrient cycling, decomposition, and plant support all depend on healthy below ground communities. When soil gets contaminated, the damage often begins underground but emerges above ground over time, as plants may grow more slowly or produce lower quality tissue. Herbivores, in that case, may lose nutritional support. Ecological productivity may decline across the system. Soil pollution therefore operates at multiple levels simultaneously, even though its origin is below the surface and often invisible to observation. The image of leaking barrels and polluted ground helps illustrate how waste dumping and industrial residues contaminate soil. Persistent synthetic chemicals and pesticides also damage the biological communities living within soil. The effects then propagate upward into plant health, into herbivores that feed on those plants, and into the wider food web above the ground. Noise pollution provides a clear, non-chemical example of ecological stress. Many organisms rely on sound for defending their territory, attracting mates, detecting predators, navigating landscapes, and maintaining social communication. Human-generated noise from roads, railways, aircraft, and urban activity can interfere with all of these functions. Birds may be unable to communicate across territories. Animals may struggle to detect threats. Organisms that use sound for mating may find their signals disrupted. This means a habitat can still be physically present, but function less well under persistent noise, and biodiversity can decline without any obvious physical removal of the habitat. Light pollution similarly changes the natural rhythm of darkness and light that has governed life on Earth across evolutionary time. Many organisms rely on these cycles for feeding, migration, reproduction, and orientation. Insects are drawn to artificial lights, disrupting their populations and of the species that feed on them. Migratory birds often become disoriented by urban light. Today, light pollution is particularly significant in urban and peri-urban landscapes. This slide compares the same region at night in 1992 and 2013 using the same satellite and the same sensor. And the images make clear how much artificial light in the environment has increased over just 2 decades. The images therefore help us see light pollution not simply as a sign of development, but as a rapidly expanding ecological stressor that can disrupt long established behavioral and physiological adaptations to darkness. Pollution is not only chemical. Chemicals can poison living systems through direct toxicity, but noise disrupts behavior and communication. Light alters ecological timing and orientation. These non-chemical forms act through different mechanisms, but the outcome is still ecological stress and potential biodiversity damage. This broader understanding prevents us from treating pollution only as a toxicology question. It is an ecological question that spans physiology, behavior, and community dynamics. Now let us organize the main ecological effects of pollution. The first is direct toxicity, which damages tissues and reduces survival. The second is reduced reproduction, where contamination impairs fertility or development. The third is behavioral disruption, where pollution changes how organisms feed, move, or communicate. The fourth is habitat quality decline, where pollution degrades ecological suitability even when the habitat physically remains. The fifth is food web contamination, where pollutants move through ecological relationships. Now, these effects are not always separate. They can combine and reinforce each other in the same system. The most direct effect of pollution is toxicity. Pollutants can damage tissues, disrupt metabolism, impair growth, and in severe cases even cause death. But sublethal effects also matter greatly. A species may not die immediately, and yet it may still suffer weaker immunity, reduced growth, impaired reproduction, or changed behavior. These sublethal effects alter long-term population dynamics, even when mortality appears to be low. Sensitive species often respond first, declining before more tolerant species are visibly affected. And as they are lost, the community structure begins to change and the ecological functions they provide may start to weaken. Pollution often reduces biodiversity by lowering reproductive success rather than by killing adults directly. So fertility may fall. Eggs may fail to develop normally. Larval and juvenile stages are frequently more sensitive to pollutants than adults. And this creates a delayed effect that is often hard to detect. A population may look active and present while its ability to replace itself quietly declines. Over time, population size falls even though adults remain visible. Recovery then becomes harder because the reproductive foundation is already weakened, which is why pollution requires long-term monitoring rather than a snapshot observation. Behavioral disruption is another important pathway through which pollution reduces ecological function. When organisms change feeding, movement, mating, or predator avoidance under pollution stress, the consequences extend far beyond the individual. Food webs depend on behavior. Pollination, seed dispersal, and predation all require animals behaving normally. If behavior is disrupted, ecological interactions weaken, even before mortality becomes visible. The image on this slide shows sea turtle hatchlings using the natural horizon light to find the sea, moving from darkness towards light and thus towards the sea, whereas the land areas have vegetation and so they are darker. This image shows sea turtle hatchlings becoming confused and disoriented by human sources of light, illustrating how light pollution can disrupt behavior. Noise and light are the clearest examples of behavioral disruption. But chemical pollutants also alter behavior by altering the nervous system or changing hormonal signals. The ecological result is that systems can begin to function poorly and biodiversity can decline well before any dramatic mortality event. And this is why behavioral indicators are increasingly used in ecological monitoring. A change in animal behavior can be an early warning of pollution stress before populations show any measurable decline. Pollution is also a form of habitat degradation. A wetland may still hold water, a forest may still have trees, a soil system may still appear structurally present, but contamination can reduce ecological suitability sharply. Organisms that depend on clean water, uncontaminated soil, or quiet acoustic conditions may no longer survive or reproduce in that habitat. We should therefore understand pollution not as something separate from habitat, but as a mechanism that degrades habitat quality from within. The image of Nilgiri Tar with plastic trash inside Mukurti National Park shows this clearly. Because even when habitat still appears intact, contamination can sharply reduce its ecological suitability for wildlife. Food web contamination explains how pollution can affect organisms far from the original source. Some contaminants are not easily broken down and then they accumulate in biological tissues. The food chain shown here, from grass to insect to frog to snake to hawk, helps us visualize how a pollutant can move step by step through ecological relationships, with concentrations becoming greater at higher trophic levels. Apex predators, large fish, birds of prey, and marine mammals can be among the most heavily affected, even with no direct contact with the original pollution source. An organism may decline not because it was directly exposed to a pollutant, but because its food source changed, its breeding habit deteriorated, or a species that it depended on was affected first. The example of egg thinning due to DDT shows this clearly. Birds were not directly exposed in most cases. Instead, grasslands and wetlands were sprayed, the chemical entered food chains, and birds received exposure through bioaccumulation and biomagnification, leading to reproductive damage over time. And this is why pollution ecology requires a systems perspective, not just a species by species or source by source analysis. The full picture of ecological harm often includes effects that are spatially distant, temporally delayed, and mechanistically indirect. Let us apply these ideas to a concrete example. Excess nutrient input into a water body can strongly alter ecological balance. The image of eutrophication helps us see this process clearly, because when nitrogen and phosphorus accumulate beyond normal levels, they drive excessive growth of algae and other organisms, while reducing oxygen availability in the water. Sensitive species, including many invertebrates and fish, may then decline. More tolerant organisms may become dominant, shifting community composition. Even though the water body is physically present, its biodiversity may be substantially reduced and its ecological processes significantly changed. Pesticides are designed to affect specific pest organisms, but non-target species are frequently harmed as well. Soil invertebrates that support decomposition may be damaged. Aquatic invertebrates at the base of freshwater food webs may be reduced. Pollinators may suffer sublethal effects that weaken colony health. As these organisms decline, the ecological support systems that agriculture depends on also weaken. This shows how pollution in production landscapes can feed back into broader biodiversity loss and ultimately undermine the systems that sustain agriculture itself. Industrial pollution represents some of the most persistent forms of ecological contamination. Heavy metal such as lead, mercury, cadmium, and arsenic can remain in sediments, soils, and organisms for very long periods. They move through water, they accumulate in food webs, and they affect multiple trophic levels simultaneously. Recovery is typically slow, even after the original source has been controlled, because contaminants remain in the environment and continue affecting organisms long after active discharge has stopped. This is one of the clearest demonstrations of why prevention is far more effective than remediation. Pollution is consistently underestimated because its effects are often delayed and the damage may be invisible at first. Organisms begin to respond before the source or scale of the problem becomes visually obvious. And so a landscape can appear intact while ecological quality is actually declining. This gap between appearance and ecological reality is a central challenge in conservation management. The absence of a visible crisis is not evidence of ecological health. I should repeat this: the absence of a visible crisis is not an evidence of ecological health. And careful measurement and an understanding of pollution mechanisms are necessary to detect what appearance alone cannot reveal. Because pollution is often hidden or delayed, monitoring becomes a core tool of ecological management. Managers cannot rely on visual appearance alone. Ecological monitoring uses repeated observations, biological indicators, chemical measurements, and trend analysis to detect patterns that single snapshots would miss. Early detection improves response time, reduces the scale of eventual damage, and gives management a better chance of protecting species and systems before decline becomes severe. Monitoring forms the practical link between ecological understanding and effective environmental response. It is also important to keep in mind that pollution rarely acts alone. Habitats already degraded by land use change are more fragile under pollution stress. Populations already reduced by overexploitation have less capacity to recover when contamination is present. Invasive species may exploit communities weakened by pollution, gaining advantage over native species already under pressure. Multiple stressors therefore tend to reinforce one another, and their combined effect is often greater than any single threat would produce alone. And when ecological quality declines through pollution, the services ecosystems provide to people also decline. Fisheries dependent on clean water become less productive. Agricultural systems that rely on healthy soils and pollinators lose ecological support. Water security may also be reduced. Public health costs increase. Livelihoods built on natural resources become undermined. The ecological cost and the social cost of pollution are not separate. They occur together. They compound each other and they make pollution a central sustainability challenge rather than a peripheral environmental concern. Pollution also reduces biodiversity and weakens ecosystem services. These ecological losses generate long-term social and economic costs. The longer pollution continues, the harder those costs are to reverse. And this is why prevention and source reduction are central to sustainability planning, and why pollution is addressed in sustainability frameworks alongside resource management, land use planning, and climate action. Prevention is almost always more effective and less costly than cleanup. Once a pollutant has spread through water, soil, air, or a food web, removing it is technically difficult, ecologically incomplete, and very expensive. The image of an airplane spraying chemical dispersants after an oil spill makes this point clearly. Good environmental planning therefore focuses on reducing pollutants at the point of origin, improving industrial and agricultural practices, and setting standards that limit what enters ecosystems in the first place. Improving waste management limits the pathways through which pollutants enter land, water, and air. The image of boom barriers protecting aquaculture shows how response measures can reduce damage after pollution has spread. But such interventions are far more expensive and limited than preventing the problem at source. Prevention reduces the effort needed. Monitoring detects ongoing problems. Restoration rebuilds what is lost. And together they form a coherent management strategy. Effective pollution management begins with the right questions. What is the specific pollutant or stressor? Where is it entering the system? Which organisms, habitats, or processes are most vulnerable? Is the effect acute or chronic? Is the damage direct through toxicity or indirect through food webs and behavioral disruption? These questions move management beyond reactive responses. They help focus effort where it is most needed, and they prevent the mistake of treating pollution as a single uniform problem when it actually works through a very different mechanisms in different ecological contexts. Now let us review the key terms from this lecture. Acute pollution is sudden and severe. Chronic pollution is prolonged, repeated, and continuous at lower levels. Contamination refers to the presence of harmful substances in environment media or organisms. Toxicity refers to the harmful biological effects those substances produce. Food web contamination describes how pollutants move through ecological relationships from one trophic level to another. Habitat degradation refers to the decline in ecological quality or suitability. This slide brings together the full picture of this week. Human pressure on biodiversity grows through population and consumption. Habitat change weakens biodiversity by reducing and fragmenting the conditions that species need. Overexploitation reduces populations faster than they can recover. Invasive species disrupt community structure and ecological processes. And pollution degrades ecological quality through chemical, energy, and behavioral mechanisms. These are not five isolated problems. They are five interconnected forms of pressure that combine and reinforce one another. And understanding them together is essential for understanding why biodiversity is declining at the scale we observe globally. As you prepare to revise this lecture, work through four questions. First, can you define pollution in ecological terms? Can you explain its full scope, including non-chemical forms? Second, can you distinguish acute from chronic pollution clearly? Third, can you explain the main mechanisms through which pollution affects organisms, populations, and communities? And fourth, can you apply these ideas to a real conservation or sustainability problem, linking pollution to ecosystem services, management responses, or policy decisions? These four directions cover the depth expected in an applied context. In the next week, we move to Threats in the Modern World, Part 2. We will add climate change, large-scale disturbance, disease, and infrastructure impacts to the threat picture. Each introduces its own ecological mechanisms, and together they deepen the framework we have been building. The next sessions will show how the threat landscape extends further than the pressures covered so far. Before we close, consider this question. How can the ideas discussed about pollution across air, water, soil, noise, and light help us understand or solve a real sustainability challenge? Think about a specific context you know, a city, a river, a farming region, or a coastal area, and ask which forms of pollution are present, which organisms are most likely affected, whether effects are acute or chronic, and what combination of prevention, monitoring, and restoration would be most relevant. Connecting lecture concepts to a concrete context is one of the most effective ways to deepen understanding and prepare for applied questions. That is all for today. Thank you for your attention. Jai Hind.